Okay, Kevin, you and I both play in the Stopa Law Firm League. It's a 2 QB league. It's really a QB and a QB flex eligible, which almost everybody uses as a QB. I love this format of a league. It's a lot different than your standard scoring format, than your standard format generally. It values the quarterbacks more accurately. It makes it play a lot more like it would in the NFL, where you value every starting quarterback. I think more leagues should play with 2 QBs.
Yeah, I like the format, as you said, and I think we both can agree. Our colleague Mark Stopa, who runs the league, probably had the best team last year. He went in heavy on quarterbacks because they score the most points in this type of format. I think that's the right strategy to have. So I'm curious this year to see how the draft unfolds. We're going to hold an auction. I believe we each get $200 to see how much gets spent on all these quarterbacks. But I like the idea. I like the concept. As you said, it mirrors real-life football the most in that the quarterback is the most important player on the field. So definitely like the format and like going with 2 quarterbacks.
Right. And for everybody that doesn't know Kevin already, he's Kevin Payne, writes for us at RotoWire.com. You hear him on XM a lot all the time, too. Kevin, thanks for stepping in for List this week, out fomenting revolution in Central America. So glad to have you here. And we're going to make you a regular part of these video casts, I think. At any rate, let's talk about nailing this format down, how to get it right. As you mentioned, Stopa valued the elite quarterbacks, and I think there's a point, too, in evaluating the elite guys, not just any quarterback, but that people weren't paying enough for the Peyton Mannings of the world. Peyton Manning, Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees, those guys weren't getting priced up enough. It's not necessarily all quarterbacks. They're not even, but paying up in 2 quarterback leagues, paying for the elite starting quarterbacks.
Yeah, and there's such a good floor with those 3, and I think everybody's consensus is those are the top 3. You got Breeze and Manning and Rodgers. There's such a safe floor with all 3 of those guys. They produce consistently. I might have a little reservations with Manning. He's another year older. He's had the neck problem in the past, but didn't show any signs of slowing down last year. It's his offense. He can do what he wants, and that's the key. I'm curious to see how much those guys go for. Now, all that being said, I think my strategy heading into this season is to take a look at some of these other guys who I think have fallen off a little bit but could still produce a great value. I'll tell you right now that in some of the mocks I've done, the RotoWire Vegas League that we did, I'm happy to wait around and take a guy like a Cam Newton or a Matthew Stafford kind of in the middle rounds who are becoming at a discount. And believe it or not, Matthew Stafford, who had a down year by his cumulative stats last year, was still 3rd passing in the league. So I'm looking for some value this year, and I think that's going to happen, especially because I think those 3 guys might just get priced way too high.
Interesting. And let's talk about these guys individually. Cam Newton, he's got an entire new receiving core. The only guy that's really returning is Greg Olsen. No Steve Smith anymore. Who in that receiving core are you buying into to help make sure that Newton earns that value?
I guess if you're going to go with some guy, you got to go with Kelvin Benjamin. You look at the guy, and the comps are Kelvin Johnson. He's very raw. He's not quite polished yet. But as you said, no Steve Smith, no Brandon LaFell anymore. And every time I think of Brandon LaFell, I could just kind of have this picture in my head of him dropping a ball on 3rd down that he should have caught. So it's interesting that they went ahead and just totally revamped the wide receivers. As you said, he's got his safety blanket in Greg Olsen. But I guess if I'm going to go with one guy, it's going to be Kelvin Benjamin, especially in standard non-PPR formats. This guy's a huge red zone target. You could see them just throwing the lob to him every once in a while. You could see Cam Newton faking that quarterback sneak, and he's probably going to have one-on-one coverage on the outside. Just throw it up to him, let him go get it. He's definitely the guy that intrigues me the most amongst their wide receivers.
Right, exactly. Now, I'm a little concerned about Newton just because of the health standpoint, too. I mean, he had the ankle issue in the offseason. He's clear to do everything right now, but is that a lingering concern for you at all?
Not really. And I remember when I thought that he hurt his ankle. I've seen this happen twice. I think it was last year, if not last year and the year before. He turned his ankle badly. LaShawn McCoy turned his ankle badly. And all I could think of is this was a normal human being. They would be on the shelf for 4 to 6 weeks based upon what I saw. And both guys stayed in the game. Both guys were able to play the rest of the season. I don't get it, but he's superhuman. But you got to remember, this guy is 260 pounds. He's bigger than most of these linebackers that are coming up and hitting him. So I've kind of given in. I think later on in his career, I'll worry a little bit more. But I think still, while the mileage is somewhat low on him, I'm going to be okay drafting Cam Newton this year.
All right. As for Matthew Stafford, Liss is on board, not on board at all with Stafford. He's on board with being a Stafford hater. always talk, and maybe not hater, that's maybe overstating the case, but thinks that Stafford gets overdrafted, thinks that the change in offensive coordinators isn't going to change his value that much. What say you?
I love Stafford. You know they're going to throw the ball. I'm not completely sold that this defense is great. And the other thing I like about him, too, is you look at this division, you know Chicago's going to be tough. You know the Packers are going to be tough. This is a guy that's still going to be throwing the ball around come your playoff weeks because they're going to be fighting for a wild card spot. They're going to be jostling for position inside the division. Who knows? Maybe Minnesota. You still have Adrian Peterson. Maybe Teddy Bridgewater is better than what we thought, and he can lead this team somewhere. But I get the idea that this guy's going to have to throw the ball a lot once again. Obviously, he has Calvin Johnson. I just think that there's a lot of upside here. As I said, had a down year by his standards last year and still was third in the NFL in passing yardage. I could see those numbers going up, and I'm fine taking him. I believe in the RotoWire mock. I took him somewhere around the 6th or 7th round. Totally comfortable taking him in that spot, given the amount of upside and given what he's done in the past. Again, I'm looking at cumulative stats, not efficiency stats. That's all that really matters when you're talking about fantasy football.
You know, it's interesting. I just pulled up the Lions' schedule, and I almost never look at schedule going into a season. But looking at them, if you're gonna use the Lions, you know, look at the Lions at all, their division schedule is extremely backloaded. Final 3 games are against division foes. 4 out of their last 5 weeks are against division foes. Only 2 games early on against their division opponents. They're good teams, but the thing is, Minnesota and Green Bay, their defenses aren't really spectacular. Chicago had a hard time stopping the run last year. I don't know how that's going to affect Stafford necessarily, but funny thing is, like, he doesn't get the feast on his division early in the season. Fantasy playoffs, great, except for that Week 17 game you don't even get to use, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's kind of interesting because now that you say that, I was thinking about the Ray Rice suspension today and the Baltimore Ravens. Theirs is exactly the opposite. They're division loaded beginning of the season, so it's interesting how they kind of make them out. I guess if I had to have my way, I would have these division games be towards the end of the season because that's when they're going to matter the most. Let these guys go ahead and fight it out when it counts, when they're trying to get, win out the division, get the wild card spot, have them go up against each other. Most of these teams, when you go ahead and take a look at where these good rivalries are in football, it's within the division. So I'd rather see them backloaded more than front-loaded.
All right. Well, speaking of Ray Rice, let's talk a little Ravens. First of all, quick sidebar on Ray Rice, and we'll go back to 2 QBs. But 2 games. I thought that was laughably low for someone that knocked his fiance out.
No. Yeah, just unbelievable. And you kind of saw the outrage on Twitter. I don't know how the NFL got this wrong. It is absolutely ridiculous. You cannot find one person out there right now that says that this was, the crime fits the punishment. Should have been at least 4 games. And I know all along people were saying 2 to 4 games, but to me, this was 8 games at least. You look at what other people get suspended for in the NFL for doing, in my standards, much, much less. We've talked a lot about, Justin Blackman and Josh Gordon and marijuana. Well, marijuana is legal in a bunch of states now, and you can't tell me that these guys who get, 8 games for doing that's worse than knocking out your fiance. They get married the next day. I mean, this is reality TV made in heaven, whatever's going on in the Ray Rice home, but laughably low suspension. And the takeaway, though, for me is Bernard Pierce isn't going to have as long of a leash. He's not going to get as much audition time. I believe Ray Rice will come back. I believe Week 3 they play Cleveland. I think they got Pittsburgh the first game. And Cincinnati, I believe, is the second game. I believe those are the first 2 games. So the takeaway is Bernard Pierce isn't going to get as big of an audition, but it's curious to see if he has success in those 2 games, how that's going to affect the workload in the backfield for the Ravens.
Right. In fact, it's Cincinnati September 7th, September 11th, the Thursday game against Pittsburgh, home game against Pittsburgh. So you're right. Very front load, and then Cleveland. So they play 3 straight division games to begin the year. Very odd schedule. And all but their, week 17 is always division matches with everyone. So they play Cleveland in week 17. But other than that, they're done after November 2nd in division. Very strange schedule for Baltimore. Let's look at one of the things about 2 QB leagues is that we actually get to see guys like Joe Flacco are actually valued in this league because in real life they are, and I like that they're valued. I like that you have to pay attention to Joe Flacco's and Carson Palmer and Jake Lockers of the world, that they're important, that you need to kind of distinguish between them. What the difference is between Andy Dalton and Joe Flacco. Getting that right is important.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I know that I've heard you guys on the radio. I've heard Liz talk about like a guy like Tony Romo. They could have a historically bad defense. He may be throwing it all over the place. Phillip Rivers bounced back last year, and the cool thing about this league is, we've seen Cam Newton come on and make a splash instantly. What's to say that Johnny Manziel, if he gets handed the starting job from day one? Now, granted, the receiving core is very, very thin there in Cleveland, especially with Josh Gordon. I believe August 1st they're going to come down with his suspension, and he's appealing it. But I got to think after his DUI that he's going to be suspended for the full season. But Johnny Manziel could be an interesting guy. All these guys who use their legs, Colin Kaepernick, Russell Wilson, RG3, they all get a boost because you know darn well you're not going to get any type of rushing out of guys like Tom Brady, Drew Brees, Peyton Manning. So they kind of go ahead and bridge the gap, which is why, as I said, I might, doing this 2-quarterback league, take a look at some of these guys that might offer some value, whose price is not going to be where the Elite 3 is, but have the potential to produce just as much. And then maybe I go ahead and I bolster up my wide receivers or my tight ends. We're going to start 2 tight ends in this league, so that means something, as well as my running backs.
Kevin, one of the things about 2 QB leagues that you have to get right is actually the league structure. So it's not just like 2 QBs be all end all. One of the things that's also good is we have 2 tight ends in this league, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, and 2 flex spots. So there's a lot of moving parts that you can actually and one of those is actually QB flex, but then there's another standard flex spot. Point being is there's a lot of positions. It's PPR. I think was it half point or 3/4 point? I forget what it was last year.
It's half point.
Half point. And that was a subject of debate. I mean, I know some people feel differently about PPR, but I think when you're introducing 2 quarterbacks, I think it makes a little bit more sense that you don't have to have 2 QBs going for you every week. Usually it's advantageous, but say if you got a really bad matchup or a bye week matchup that you don't like, you can actually plug in the running back or receiver instead. I like that sort of flexibility. I think it makes for a lot more playable league that at any point in the draft, if you're in a draft, in a snake draft, or any point in the auction, these players are valued roughly equally.
Yeah, the other interesting thing about this league, too, is that I believe we only have, and correct me if I'm wrong, 4 or 5 bench spots. So that becomes critical, too, because you're less likely to go ahead and try to handcuff somebody. You really just want to draft and get the most upside possible because sooner or later, chances are when it comes to a bye week, starting in the middle of the season there, you're probably going to have to drop somebody you don't want. And then that also kind of leads to some interesting trades, people trying to get the most value rather than dropping the guy. So that's also something you got to take into consideration is how many bench spots your league has. As I said, I think it's only 4 or 5 in this league, but you see guys who are very useful get dropped and then go ahead and get rebought by somebody else when fab bidding comes around.
All right, Kevin, who's a quarterback outside of the top 15 that you like? We're going to use the RotoWire rankings as a proxy, so it cuts off at Ben Roethlisberger. You don't get Romo, you don't get Rivers, you don't get Russell Wilson as part of this equation. But it's a 2 QB league or QB flex league. Who's a guy outside of that top 15 that you want to roster for the upside?
There's a couple guys. I'm a little bit intrigued with Chad Henne because when he's been given the chance, he's kind of been okay. He's got some weapons down there, and I can't see that the defense is going to be that great that he might have to throw it a lot. But I guess, and this is totally homer pick, I'm going to stick with E.J. Manuel. We see the glowing reports out of Sammy Watkins, out of Bill's camp right now. You got to remember they got Eric Wood, they got T.J. Graham. They've got a lot of weapons in this offense, and with such a potent running game, I mean, they added Bryce Brown. You've already got Freddie Jackson and obviously C.J. Spiller. Those are all guys that he can dump the ball off to and can go the whole distance or pick up 40, 50 yards of receiving for him per game. I just think with this wide receiver core, I'm very curious to see what they can do. The blow to Kiko Alonso probably helps Manuel's value just because he can go ahead now and he might have to sling the ball more. The Bills' defense might not be as good. They may be involved in more higher scoring games. And I think he had enough experience last year that there's a big step forward he could possibly make this year. You also got to remember, too, that he is a little bit mobile. That's not his forte. He's not going to go ahead and run the ball a ton. But if he needs to, he can go ahead and break containment and go ahead and scamper and get a bunch of yardage that way as well. So probably outside of the top 15, I've got to say he's probably the one that most intrigues me.
I'll stay in the division. I'll say Ryan Tannehill for me. I liked some signs that he had last year. I think I want to see him have 1 year where he has a decent offensive line, so he's not throwing from his back the whole time. I think some of the, he'll build that chemistry with Mike Wallace that was lacking last year. They'll have time to run some of those deeper patterns, what Wallace is so good at doing. I think that they're building some of the guys around him are going to be better in the long run too. So, and you got to keep in mind Tannehill played a lot of wide receiver in college too, so he's still got a little bit more of a developmental curve too. So I think I like Tannehill a little bit. in this league, you might see me throw the extra buck on him. So you can bid me up a couple more if you want, but I still might take him.
He's an interesting guy too, because were we talking about Charles Clay at this time last year? And being a 2 tight end league, it's going to be very relevant for him. And Brian Hartline's just a great possession receiver. He's kind of like his little safety valve. And as you said, if Wallace can get open downfield, and I think too much has been made about they didn't work out in the offseason and all that, I think that they'll be just fine. I think that year 2, they'll have their timing down much better, and you'll see Wallace make a lot more plays this year.
All right, very good. All right, what's one quarterback, an expensive quarterback that you won't go the extra dollar on? Who's one guy that you'll stop when the bidding goes high?
It's got to be Peyton Manning. I don't mind spending the money on Aaron Rodgers. He's a little bit more mobile. Had the little injury last year, but stayed relatively healthy. He's got a ton of weapons. Yeah, he lost James Jones, but they seem to be able to go ahead and find receivers that are anywhere. Good running game. Eddie Lacy's going to help keep opposing defenses honest. But Peyton Manning, something worries me about him. It's sooner or later we're going to see the decline. And kind of what I'm thinking about is, and not maybe this drastic, but remember when Joe Montana played for Kansas City? Sooner or later, Father Time's going to catch up to him. As I said earlier, he's had the neck injury. That's another little bit of a red flag. So I guess if the bidding stops, out of the big 3, Peyton Manning, Drew Brees, and Aaron Rodgers, Peyton Manning's going to be the one I stop on.
All right, very good. I don't know how I'm going to treat Manning. It depends on how I map out my strategy. Kind of depends on the room, too, when he comes up and all that. Kind of mapping that one out still. Looking forward to it. That's not that far away, though. We're a couple weeks away from this auction, so it'll be fun. Kev, good insight. Fun doing this with you. We'll do it again sometime soon.
All right, thanks for having me, Jeff.
You bet. That's RotoWire's Kevin Payne. Chris Liss will be back next week. Thanks for watching RotoWire TV.